Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and we have a very special episode for you today. I was fortunate enough to be able to interview Jessie Serfilippi, who is a writer and historical researcher who has contributed to, among other things, the book Fierce, Essays by and About Dauntless Women. And her contribution to that book happens to be about today's subject, Deborah Sampson, who was a woman who dressed up as a man to fight with the Continental Army. And I have asked her several questions about the life of Deborah Sampson. So without further ado, let's get to it. Hi, Jessie. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about Deborah Sampson, who is one of the women who fought in the Revolutionary War.
Yes, yeah. Thank you for having me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, my pleasure. So I'm just going to ask you a few questions, and hopefully we can all learn something about Deborah Sampson. So to start off, where was she from?
So, Deborah Sampson was born on December 15th, 1760, in Plimpton, Massachusetts. Very much a New England girl. She lives most of her, she lives her whole life in Massachusetts, except for when she's off fighting in the Revolutionary War. And we'll see a little bit later on when she leaves Massachusetts for a bit as well.
Interesting. So when the war broke out, she was still relatively young.
She was. She was quite young when the war broke out. She is actually only 21 when she enlists in 1782. So she was a teenager for most of the war leading up to that.
Interesting. And why did she decide to join the Continental Army?
There's a lot of different theories. Her main biographer, Herman Mann, who you got to take everything he says with like a giant grain of salt, because while she gave him permission to write about her life, he also sensationalizes it. So he really portrays her as, patriotic. She wants to let go of the bounds of her gender in that time period, and that probably had a lot to do with it. She was what was called a masterless woman, actually, which means that she is in her late teens, early 20s. She has really no family holding her accountable. She has really no one, no husband who's holding her accountable. She is her own person. And she's also very educated. She worked on a farm as an indentured servant. She could do housework. So she had this really rare combination of skills, and she was beholden to nobody. And she probably didn't like how her gender confined her. That probably was part of it. There's no like one answer. It was probably a lot of things going in. And another kind of big thing is that there was this popular story about a woman named Hannah Snell, who basically was the Deborah Sampson over in England. She successfully enlisted over there, and her story became a huge sensation, and Deborah was likely aware of that.
That's extremely interesting. So let me ask you, with Deborah, she didn't just join the Continental Army, she dressed in drag, for lack of a better term?
She did dress as a man, and her first attempt to enlist was not successful because she made the mistake of doing so in her town, basically her hometown where she'd been living for most of her life. And from an accident, she wrote differently. So one of the people who saw her enlist was like, "That's Deborah Sampson," just because of the way she held a pen from an accident. So she actually got into a lot of trouble. The Baptist church she had joined kicked her out. So she ran off and she did try again. And she was finally successful in joining. She enlisted on May 23rd, 1782. And a lot of people kind of wonder, why would she enlist then? Yorktown, the main battle, had already happened. But there was still a war going on. Deborah knew this. They were actually actively calling for people to enlist, and she was one of those people.
Interesting. So she gets in, and what do we know about her time in the service?
So she actually is one of a few soldiers who gets selected to serve in the light infantry. And you had to fit a bunch of requirements, including a height requirement to be in the light infantry. you had to be really agile, you would be carrying a lot of stuff. Basically, they were some of the hardest working soldiers in the army. And she is sent to southern New York to what is today Westchester County. It was kind of a no man's land. It was called neutral ground, but it was a full out civil war. The revolution is very much a civil war, but if we really want to get an idea of that, you look at southern New York and you see the loyalists and the patriots are really infighting there. They're raiding, they're stealing from each other. So Deborah and the other men in her company there are really going in to try and take this ground from, I guess you could say, both sides and make it more stabilized, but in American hands rather than the British coming up from New York City.
That's amazing. And I couldn't agree with you more about it being a civil war. I've mentioned that several times on this channel. Thank you. So eventually, she's found out. How does that happen?
So Deborah actually is doing a pretty great job of keeping her gender a secret. She is living with men. Somehow she avoids all of them finding out. She says she's 18, which is how she kind of, keeps her lack of facial hair. She explains it that way. But she eventually is serving as a waiter to General Patterson. But then she gets sent to Philadelphia in 1783 and she falls ill. It's not entirely clear what illness she had, but she was so ill that she was almost mistaken for dead. But somebody took her pulse and discovered, hey, she's alive. So this French doctor, Dr. Barnabas Binet, who is the best name, I think, he accidentally discovers her secret when he goes to take her heartbeat, her pulse, and he finds all the binding around her chest. And he's a great guy because once he finds out, he doesn't expose her. He actually takes her to his home and has her recover there so that nobody else will know she's the woman.
Very interesting. So she goes. Does she go back to join the battlefront?
Yeah, so what happens is he gives her a letter, basically, and she knows that she has to deliver this letter, likely to General Patterson. It's not clear how this goes down, but we do know that she got an honorable discharge, and that was not what she expected. There were other examples of women who tried to enlist and serve, and they were drummed out of camp, which is not what you wanted. So she gets an honorable discharge from Henry Knox, actually, and she goes back to civilian life, but at first she actually goes back to civilian life as a man.
Interesting. I was not aware that her discharge was from Henry Knox. So it was fairly, I don't want to say well known, but amongst the officers and generals, it was known that she was a she.
By that point, yes, yeah, definitely. General Patterson knew once he read the letter from the doctor, and then Henry Knox would have known as well to give her that honorable discharge.
That's fascinating. I was mistakenly under the impression Patterson gave her the discharge. Thank you for that. So she leaves the war. She lives for as a man for a little while, as you said. And then what happens to her after the war, or after she leaves the war?
So yeah, she's living with her uncle under her brother's name for a while, and then she actually ends up meeting a guy, Benjamin Gannett, and she decides to marry him. It's unclear what kind of relationship they had because let's just say they get married and the baby comes less than 9 months later. So we don't know what kind of relationship they really shared. And later on, they did not seem to have a good marriage. But she marries him and she ends up having 4 children, one of whom she adopted. But that's kind of what you could call the conventional side of her life because she does not lead a conventional life otherwise.
Interesting. So, what does she do? Does she end up working, or does she stay home as women traditionally did at the time? Or what does she decide to do with her life?
So her husband is not really successful as a farmer. This is a pretty big issue. They don't have a lot of money. And Deborah, once again, decides she's going to take fate into her own hands. And she actually petitions for her pension from about 1797 to 98. She is unsuccessful, but she needs to find a way to make money. Now, in 1797, Herman Mann, with her permission, published the biography on her. And in 1802, he helps her out by writing a speech for her to give. And she actually travels all over the place, mostly at first in Massachusetts. She does shows in Boston, Springfield, and Holden, 6 overall towns she visits in Massachusetts, talking about her time as a soldier during the American Revolutionary War. But then she even goes to Providence, Rhode Island. She goes to New York City. She goes to my native Albany, and they like her so much that she performs twice in Albany, actually. She goes to a few other places in New York, like Boston and Schenectady. And what's really fascinating, this is one of my favorite facts about her, is she is the first woman in the US to go on a lecture tour. And she travels alone for the most part. She hires stagecoaches, and she doesn't have, a man who's escorting her around like women typically had back then.
That's fascinating. Do we know how the lecture tour worked out for her financially? Was she able
She
to support her family?
She did make money, yes, she did make some money, and, one way to know this is that she actually goes on a bit of a shopping spree in Albany, so she clearly had some money that she could use for herself. She does things like gets, silk gloves and a silk shawl, and otherwise that money is going back to her family to support them once she gets home. She's out on the road for about a year, so I imagine she is sending some of that money to them in the meantime.
Interesting. So after that year, does her, I assume her popularity would start to wane over time if she stopped traveling?
I don't know if it's her popularity wanes or if it's that she's got to go home. A year of traveling in the early 19th century is going to be pretty tiring. And this is very random. She was having a lot of issues with her teeth, actually. She writes about this in her journal. So she was in some pain, which could contribute to it. And she may have hit, all the towns she wanted to hit at that point.
Very interesting. And then does she spend the rest of her life in Massachusetts?
She does, and she actually spends years after this petitioning again for that pension she deserved. And in 1803, she really begins that petitioning again. That's when she returns from the lecture tour. In 1805, she does get part of it. And what's fascinating is she gets part of it because she is disabled. She was shot during the war, and there's a lot of mystery around where she was shot. Her first biographer, Herman Mann, claims she was shot in the thigh, which would have sensationalized the story even more. But no one records her having a limp. So she was likely shot in the shoulder, which is where she claimed to be shot in the first version of his biography, because the second version, which she says must be published upon my death, she doesn't want it published before her death, is the one that kind of ups the sensationalizing. So she was likely shot in the shoulder. She claimed, to have a lasting wound from that. Either she got the bullet out herself or she kept the bullet in. One of her biggest biographers, and I think the best biographer on her, Alfred Young, he has this great line in his biography where he says, "We could dig her body up and find out, but why would we do that?" So I kind of go with Deborah. She was likely shot in the shoulder, and she gets some money from being a disabled veteran, but she still isn't receiving her full pension, and she won't receive that until 1821 when she successfully gets her general pension.
Wow, that's a long time after the war ended.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
this is probably a tough segue, but speaking of digging her body up, do we know where she's buried?
Yes,
Not that
she
I am promoting anyone do that.
please don't dig her body up. She died on April 29th of 1827, and I believe she's buried in Sharon, Massachusetts. I should know for certain because I visited her grave actually. Um, I love to go to cemeteries, especially where people I study are buried. So I did get to go to her grave site, and her house actually still stands right down the road from there, which is a kind of fun fact as well.
Very interesting. Don't worry, you're not alone. There are many of us who like to go to the grave sites as well.
It's
Well,
a
Jesse, this was a fascinating interview. I appreciate your time so much. I speak for all Founder fans and say thank you. I learned a tremendous amount, and I'm sure everyone who watched did too.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
So I hope you enjoyed that interview. I certainly had a wonderful time, and thank you again to Jessie for taking the time to tell us about Deborah Sampson. Again, the book she contributed to was Fierce, Essays by and about Dauntless Women. There's a link in the description below, and I implore you to go check it out. Make sure you hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and I'll be back with another Founder tomorrow.